This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is September the 13th, 1972. We are in Blackwell, Oklahoma. This is during the period of the county fair in Blackwell, and we are interviewing Mr. Carl Randall, who is one of the longtime veterans of the city of Blackwell, and whose father made the run of 1893. Mr. Randall has lived practically all of his life since a very, very young boy in the town of Blackwell. Mr. Randall, I'm going to, you're R-A-N-D-A-L-L, is that correct?
That's right.
All right. To begin with, I would like for you to, I'd suggest hold the microphone about this distance here, and tell us to begin with who your father and mother were, and your mother's maiden name, and where they came from, and we will kind of go from there into your own background.
My father's name was John W. Randall. He came from Kansas just prior to the opening of the strip. My mother's maiden name was Ella Freeland, and she was raised in Missouri but came to Kansas, and they met and were married in Kansas.
And now they made the run of 1893. Why don't you tell about the experiences? Now you were just 1 year old,
That's right.
But I'm sure they related some of the stories and experiences of the run to you. Could you tell some of the experiences that were related to you?
That's it. He made the run in with a team and buggy, and filed on a piece of land just adjoining the city of Blackwell on the east, and where we still have a portion of that land in the family.
Yes. Do you remember? Do you recall any stories dealing with the run that your father told you or your mother?
Yes, there were many interesting stories in the run. The one that affected him most was that he had a contest on the land and had some little trouble in getting it cleared up, but he finally had a small house in Winfield. He traded this fellow to move off, so he got it without a contest. But he'd only been here a few days when someone stole his team before he had a chance to break out but a very small piece of land, and he never did recover the team. There are many interesting instances of the early days, but right at the opening, most everything, the territory had all burned off, and people had no hay for their stock. Horses in particular, most of them brought into the farm, and Mr. Blackwell, who founded the town of Blackwell, had burned off all the area, and he had moved hay and sold at $1 a bale, which was very high at that time.
I want to get back to Mr. Blackwell in a minute. I want to, one other thing on the run. Now, I know that history records that the run of 1893 was the wildest of all the runs, and that as a result of that, they had no more runs, that they had far 5 or 6 times as many people looking for land as actually got land.
That's right.
Can you describe, as your father may have to you, some of the other disputes and other problems that may have existed at the time of the run?
Well, almost every farm was contested by someone, and at that time the land office was at Perry, Oklahoma, and a little later my father was appointed as a commissioner under that office, and he proved up the various claims, and there were contests in the court for months and years afterward before they were all settled.
Did people stake Blackwell out as a town prior to?
Yes, sir. There were 3 80-acre tracts that had belonged to some Indians, and A.J. Blackwell had gotten permission from the courts to purchase this land from Indians, and later it had to be tried in court to make it legal because they were not supposed to sell the land at all, but there were thousands of people had bought lots and property, and the town was founded at that time, so it was impossible to go back and do anything about it.
Tell us about A.J. Blackwell. You know, a lot of times people usually consider the person after whom a town's named as sort of a town hero, but I've heard different other stories about Blackwell. Could you tell something about him?
Yes, sir. He was supposedly part Cherokee Indian, and he had a family, and they were peculiar in many respects, in that, for instance, he had 2 sons, and he named one of them King David and one King Solomon, and he later named the streets of the town after members of his family. We had a King David Avenue and a King Solomon Avenue, a Rose Avenue, which is his wife, and Blackwell Avenue still exists. The others have all been changed. But he was a very peculiar man, hot-headed, and at one time in the early days he brought Negroes into the town, and several saloons had opened up by that time, and the saloon keepers were bound this was going to be a white town, because Winfield, where most of the people came from, had some unpleasant dealings with Negroes, and but he brought some Negroes in and built some little shacks for them, but the saloon keepers actually drove them out of town. They ordered them out by sundown, and they got out. They were scared. Later, he had an unfortunate experience. He was building a hotel and a theater building, first one in the town, and a brick mason was working on the wall, and he decided that the man was not laying enough brick and ordered him to speed up, and the fellow made some remark back to him, and he went out to his car and got a shotgun and shot him right on the wall. It didn't kill him, but he was laid up for quite a time. It was shot from a shotgun.
How long did Mr. Blackwell live?
Well, I don't know. He left here before he died. I have no knowledge of his death, but I would say probably 10 years after the establishing of the town, before he left Blackwell.
What was his main business, Mr. Blackwell?
I don't know that he had any actual business, except in the early day when he sold his hay, but he, of course, retained a lot of lots in the town and sold off town lots from time to time, and I would say in the real estate business more than anything else. But a few years after the town got started, he had an argument with the mayor, and they had quite a feud from time to time. And he finally built a monument, a wooden monument that he dedicated to Blackwell's curly-headed mayor.
The Negroes he brought in, now he used them on his farm for baling hay and that sort of thing?
No, I think he used them in construction work mostly.
Did you know Mr. Blackwell?
No, sir, I've seen him, but I didn't know him.
You didn't know. What did he look like?
Well, he had a kind of red whiskers, and we always wondered about his Indian blood because it's unusual for he didn't have any red whiskers, but he had.
Did your father know him?
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm. What was his opinion? What was his feeling? I guess in some respects you're probably reflecting his opinion.
Well, that's right, because that's where I got my
That's where you
opinion.
got- that's what I mean. I mean, that's where you got the, how was Blackwell as you first remembered it? I suspect 7 or 8 years old. What was the town like?
Well, most of the buildings were a frame structure. There was one two-story building that had the semblance of brick, but it was a tin outside painted brick on the, not brick. Later, the brick buildings began to grow up, but the town always thrived with saloons, and they usually had the better buildings in the town. There were 8 at one time, and town was pretty small at that time.
You remember any of the old saloon stories or any of the experiences that happened in relation to these?
Well, I don't remember too many, except that one of our prominent farmers at the edge of town came in and evidently had too much to drink, and he rode his horse in the saloon, and they tried to run him out, and he pulled a 6-shooter out and shot the mirrors all off the wall, but the next day he came back and paid him for everything.
This was up until, of course, Blackwell was in Oklahoma Territory, and of course it became dry all of a sudden in 1907.
That's right.
Why don't you tell about what was it like on this particular time? Saloons played such a big role, and then in November 1907 it was outlawed. What
right.
happened in that?
Well, when they knew that the date was officially set for closing, they advertised a sale. Every saloon had a big sale, and they carried liquor out there and by the car loads or buggy loads at that time. And it was much cheaper, of course. They cleared the walls, and those buildings sat idle for a while, but it wasn't long till they were all filled with some merchandise, some kind.
Best buildings in town, someone.
That's right.
As you grew up in Blackwell, what were some of the most interesting things, thinking of your boyhood at the present time, what were some of the interesting occasions that you recall?
Well, the entertainment was entirely different in those days. And we lived on a farm, although it was right at the edge of town, and the Chamber of Commerce at that time was known as the Board of Trade, and they had, for entertainment, they chose up sides and decided to have a coon hunt, or they called it a coon hunt, but they had points for possum, skunks, and coons, and any varmint. And my father was on one side, and I happened to know about a tree that had a possum in it. There was a hole. You could see it every now and then. I'd seen him poke his head out. And I told one of the fellows that was on this hunt about it, and they went up there and poked this possum out with a forked stick, and it was a female, and she had 14 little possums in her pouch. And it occasioned a trial before they could settle it, because that was enough to win the prize. It was dinner they were putting on for the other side. And it turned the tide of the game.
Coon hunt and the possum hunt was quite an event, really a social event, almost like the fox hunt is in the fox area. Why don't you describe some of the various things that go along with Just describe what it's like, the coon hunt and the possum hunt as it was in those days.
Well, a lot of the farmers had coon dogs, they called them. They were black and tan. There were several varieties of them, I know. And they used the lights and went down the river. And there were quite a few raccoons and possums along the Saskatchewan River where they were hunting. And they made quite an event of it. They'd go out and build a big fire, and they'd work out from there. It was usually in the fall of the year. And they'd go on till morning sometimes. And they were quite big events, even though not this particular contest wasn't their only coon hunts, but they put lots of them on. But usually with dogs, and each man would boast that his herd of dogs was the best, but they never proved anything. They all seem to find some possum and coons.
Can you think of any other events as you were growing up? Thinking still of boyhood.
Well, I remember one that hit our family very hard in the very early days. The county seat was at Newkirk, but the county treasurer lived at Kildare, which is a little town to the south of Newkirk. And in those days, the treasurers didn't make, they had to have personal bond because there were bonding companies weren't in existence like they are today. And my father and 4 other men signed this treasurer's bond, and the bank at Kildare went broke, and they lost all the county's money, and they had to make this bond good. And my father's portion of it was $5,000, and in those days that's almost $1 million. And it hurt the family very bad for a while, but he went back to Winfield and borrowed the money. He knew the banker there, and let him have it, and I think it took him some 5 or 6 years to pay that off, but eventually he got it all paid. But we were all a leisure after it was paid off.
What was your father's business?
In the early days, he started out with a small grocery store, but he was trained as in journalism and had always worked in the newspaper, so he finally bought a paper here, the Times Record, which is still in existence. It's a weekly paper.
Did he go into the Blackwell Daily? What was Blackwell Daily?
No, the local paper now is the Blackwell Journal Tribune, and there was a daily paper known as the Blackwell Daily News, but this present paper bought them out, and we only have one at the present time.
It's a part of the dominant.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Did your father stay in the newspaper business in his later years?
No, sir. He I don't remember, it was under the term of William Howard Taft's presidential term. He was appointed postmaster here, and he served 8 years as postmaster. And later, he followed real estate business for a short time and then retired.
In your early days, as you grew up, who were some of the leaders of the community that you recall?
Well, this man Prettyman, who was the mayor in the early day, after Blackwell. Blackwell was the first mayor, but he followed him. He was quite a prominent photographer. He had taken pictures before the strip opened of all this area through here, and he had quite a reputation, and later sold lots of his Indian pictures to libraries and museums, and he had photographed most of the chiefs that made this part of the country several states, and he was quite prominent. And there was a merchant here by the name of William Foster, who ran a mercantile store, and A.G. Barrett, who also operated a mercantile store, and Green Dallas was a banker, prominent banker of the times, and
Prettyman was the best known photographer, I guess, in early Oklahoma history.
I think that's right.
He was known all over the state, not just in Blackwell.
That's right.
Did you know him?
Yes, sir.
Tell something about him.
Well, he was a very nice man. He had several boys. I knew the boys better than I did Mr. Prettyman, but we were on speaking terms. Don was one of the boys' names. I barely remember the other first name. There were two slightly older than I am.
Did you ever watch Mr. Prettyman take pictures?
No, I don't know that I did. But he had quite a reputation as being a good photographer.
I suspect that of the early pictures in the Historical Society, for instance, that there are more Prettyman pictures than any other.
I wouldn't be surprised.
He didn't shoot the early motion pictures, did he? That's
No. I think that came after they didn't know about motion pictures at that time.
I believe it was someone from Chandler who wrote it back in the newspaper.
Yes.
Now, where did you go? You went to Blackwell High School?
Yes, I went through the grade schools and high school. Graduated in 1911, and then went 2 years to the Oklahoma Baptist College, which was located here at that time. And that's the extent of my education.
What did you study at college?
Well, I took, in addition to business course, I took the general, they require mathematics. We had, Latin was required at that time, and literature, English literature, history. Those were required subjects in those days. To pass, you had to have so many points in each one.
Can you describe what the college was like at that, going to college was like at that time? I'm sure it's greatly different from today.
Oh, very much so. It was all in one building, and later the college building, after the school moved away, was converted into an osteopathic hospital, and it was rather a large hospital. And later that same building was converted into a junior high school. Do you remember the high school?
Yeah.
And at that time they had no dormitories or anything, but later a dormitory was built across the street from the college. And I know I played football and track and basketball out there, and we had no gymnasium, but we used the building downtown for our gym. But we had to take a shower in the basement of the old college building, no hot water, all cold, and we had no lockers except some wooden lockers that had been built. The boys built themselves, and it was rather crude there.
What position did you play in football?
Halfback, and I guess that's all I ever played, halfback. And we played OSU now. It's Oklahoma A&M in that time in 11 and 12. And we played them in basketball, baseball, and track.
You ever beat them?
We did in baseball. We beat them in basketball. We beat both Oklahoma U and A&M in basketball. We had a real good team. Some of the boys came from the southern part of the state, and they were good, big, rangy boys, and they developed real good. And we won the state championship in 11 and 12.
Did you play basketball?
Yes, sir.
What position?
Center.
How tall are you?
I'm not, I'm only about 5'10".
Are you really? I thought you taller.
No.
Short for center.
Mm-hmm. We didn't have any tall boys that time.
The slender makes you look taller.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of any experiences in any of these football or basketball games, any funny or unusual experiences about a game?
Well, I remember at Stillwater, the boy that was my best friend was attending Stillwater, and we were playing, and I caught a pass and thought I was on my way for a touchdown, and he was the only fellow close to me at all, and he finally was able to catch me before I made the touchdown, and he felt bad about it, and so did I. But later, we had a number of boys attended OSU, and one of the boys later came back as our high school coach, Commodore Wheeler, and he won several state championships when we were the far smallest town to ever do it.
What did you do when you got out of college?
I went to this brick company. It was a manufacturing plant.
What's the name of it?
Blackwell Brick Company. And I worked there 27 years, and the plant finally ran out of shale, and most of the buildings in Blackwell are built from brick made there, however.
What year did you start with?
1912, late December, I think it was, at the end of 12.
Can you think that you were, during those years that you were in business there, of any of the important events of Blackwell that should be worth reminiscing about? Mr. Bathurst, if you think of something he ought to say, that he might tell about, that you might suggest as you go along.
Well, I remember that the city was without a good hotel, and they decided to build one, and they had to make some public subscriptions up to get started. And a man from Winfield agreed to, if they'd raise so much money, he would build a hotel. So we were asked to contribute $500, which was quite a little money in those days, and did. But the hotel was finished, and we were able to sell the brick, so we got back some of the money.
How big a hotel is it?
Well, it's 3-story. I think about 2.5.
The Larkin.
Yes.
Yes, I think it's 3-story. Is it still there?
Yes.
Yes, it's still there. North Main.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of any other events in Blackwell during growing up here?
Oh, there were a number of things that were important to Blackwell, I'm sure. The cemetery is about a mile south of town, and at that time we had no paved roads. And I know about public subscription, they got money enough to improve the road out to the cemetery, which was quite an event, and it all was contributed, the money was to build it.
Do you have any, what was you had some participation, I'm sure, in civic or church or other activities. What were some of your interests outside of the business itself?
Well, through the years I've served on lots of bodies. The Chamber of Commerce, I was director there for years, vice president once. I was president of the school board and a member for 10 years. I was a member of the library board for a number of years and a member of the Christian church board several times.
Taking some of these things, one thing is this Christian church, this is obviously a fairly new building, but when was this built?
This was built about 1956 or 7, wasn't it?
Yes, it has remember. Very beautiful church.
Oh, that's nice.
Built after the tornado.
Yes, sir.
Yes. I was interested in the design of that triangular design at the front. Is that an Indian reference? Is that the Indian influence, or what is the reason for that?
I can't answer that. I would doubt that because the architects were a firm from England that had been in church building for some time.
If we had the first one finished that we have, if we'll have Mr. Bathurst. We'll have go ahead and make Mr. Bathurst if someone finishes. Go ahead and move. All right. Thinking in terms of the library board now, did you tell about your library and when it came about?
Well, we have a small library in the city hall, just a room upstairs for a number of years, no building. And in about 1928, the city decided to levy for a library building. And it took 3 years to levy, and they had accumulated the money to build the building by that time. And a number of people contributed books and art things of various nature to the library. When it opened, it's a very good library today, but it was built and paid for before we ever had to do anything about it.
I'm going to swing back a little, and then we may come back up to the present, because I think an interesting thing I noticed in the questionnaire, which I just got, was that they've just brought me, was that as a young child,
Had to do anything about it.
I'm going to swing back a little, and then we may come back up to the present, because I think an interesting thing I noticed in the questionnaire, which I just got, was that they've just brought me, was that as a young child, you remember the Indians returning from Colorado and camping in your home overnight. Why don't you tell about this experience?
Well, no, it wasn't in the home. It was next to her home. This originally was the outlet for the Cherokee. They used to go to Colorado to hunt, and they went through here for thousands. But later the game diminished out there, and they were forced to quit. That's when it was open for settlement. But still a few stragglers would come through every year, and they'd have poles on the back of the horses with luggage on there, the thing they said maybe some dried meat or things. They always had a pack of dogs with them, and right next to our farm on the west was a vacant, or quite a vacant area, and they would camp there overnight quite often, and we used to just go up and look them over.
Did you visit with them?
Oh, occasionally. Most of them could talk, some of them couldn't. The older ones could not.
Did you get them coming back from Did you see them coming back from Colorado?
Yes, sir.
What would you bring them with them? What did they what meat would you bring them with?
Well, usually they would be able to kill a few deer, and out in that area it would dry, and they'd hang it up to dry. They call it jerky, and it was all kinds of meat. Occasionally one of them have some bear meat, but mostly it was meat that dried in the air out there, where it's high and dry.
Did they get into the Buffalo area over there, or had they all gone even out?
They had gone by that time. I've heard my grandfather tell about the buffalo area, he hauled hides. Buffalo hides seemed to be worth more than the buffalo. During and prior to the Civil War, he later had to go to the army, but for a while he hauled hides, and then went to the war later. And he'd tell stories about all the Indians would try to stop him and take him, but by that time they were scattered, and he never really had any trouble with them. They didn't steal them or take them away from him. But he was on a route, and if you had a wagon with some company's name on it, they'd leave you alone.
I understand, of course, that the buffalo were killed off basically for their hides.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
And were completely eliminated for hides, and the buffalo were just allowed to be eaten by the wolves.
That's
Is that
right.
right?
That's right.
There was another item in the information sheet mentioned that in the early days, 2 bandits being captured near Blackwell, Dynamite Dick killed and being taken wounded. Why don't you tell the background of this story?
Well, this group of bandits had been robbing banks, particularly all over Oklahoma. The last one had been at Red Rock, down south of here. And they came up east of Blackwell out on Duck Creek and camped at a farmhouse, just took it over. But the woman of the house was able to sneak away after dark and come into town and notify the authorities that she'd overheard them. They were going to rob the local bank here in the morning. And by that time there was a posse formed. There were 2 marshals. One of them was a fellow named Alfred Lund, and one was Josh Cox. And they headed this posse and went out there before daylight, and these fellows came down to the creek to get some water to wash their face. They just had these wash pans in their hands, and they ordered them to throw up their hands, and they didn't. They started to run, and Dynamite Dick was killed on the spot. Craven was wounded, and they brought him into town, and we had no hospital or anything. He lay in the bank lobby for about a day before they could move him out of here, and he was badly wounded, and everybody thought he would die, but at that time we had no Oklahoma prison, so they shipped him to Leavenworth, which was the Kansas prison at that time, and later he escaped from there, and eventually was caught in Missouri and identified by the wound. This man Lund was still alive here, one of the marshals, and they were able to identify him, and he'd broken out of several penitentiaries.
Did you ever see or know or any of the early day bandits?
No, I can't say that I did. Everybody went to the bank to see this fellow after he was shot. That's as close as I ever saw one.
You saw him after he shot?
Yes, sir.
Let's see, you told about Colonel Blackwell being shot by a worker.
No, he shot the worker.
He shot. Oh. Yeah, you didn't tell about that, did you?
Yes, that's
well,
right.
you told about him shooting the worker. How did you tell about the changes in the city from the early days that you remember up until prior to the paving of the streets, and then what it was like prior to the paving of the streets, and then the development over the years that you remember?
Well, in the early days, the Main Street and all of them were dirt streets, and it happened to be that Raining Brothers Circus came here because it was kind of a central point, and they always drew well with the Indians and Tonkawas and Ponkas, different tribes around. And one time they came here, and it rained heavily, and the main street was just a loblolly. And several in the parade, several of the animal cages got stuck, and they would just go get an elephant, push it out, and that was back prior to 1910, I'd say. And later, in 1917, the Blackwell Zinc Company came here, and we jumped from a town of about 2,500 to 5 or 6, 7,000 just in a few years there. I wouldn't know just how many, but they worked 800 or 900 men, which is more people than we'd ever had working here at one time. And that's that do business in the town. And they're still here, although the pollution threatens us to put them out of business, and probably will for the next year or two.
How many are they hiring now?
They still have 800 men.
Where are they located?
Just to the west of town, just west of the city. In fact, another has been brought into the city limits for police and fire protection.
What can you think of any other? Any other road? I think this is an interesting experience about the roads prior to being paved and the water, and this is something a lot of people don't conceive today as a street being unpaved, because even the country roads are now. But can you think of anything else?
Well,
Wet and muddy streets that might be interesting.
Well, the only thing I think about is interesting to me. In the summertime, we had to have a street sprinkler. Sprinkle dust down the streets to keep them out of the store, and it went down up and down the street several times a day, sprinkling the street heavily to keep the dirt down and dust. And later, after we'd paved the business area and some of the prominent residential streets, the city took over the project of blacktopping all city streets. In 1965, we had every street in Blackwell surface enough to keep you out of the mud.
You mentioned the Chamber of Commerce. Can you think of any of the activities of the Chamber that are particularly interesting or that might be worth noting?
Well, in the early days, it was known as the Board of Trade, and later changed to Commercial Club and Chamber of Commerce. From time to time, the name varied. But Blackwell, just prior to the smeller coming here, decided that they wanted to be a little bigger town, grow, and they voted the bond issue. I've forgotten the amount of it. I would say something like $200,000, and they we had opened a rather large gas field just north of the town. They ran from about 5 miles north out to 15, and gas was plentiful and no market for it. So they built a pipeline out there and offered industry gas at 3 cents a thousand to come in here and locate. And that's when the smeller came. And from that time to this, gas is now above 20 cents a thousand out there, industrial gas. And that's considered cheap today, but in those days, 3-cent gas. And the city had always owned power and light plant. They built it in 1913, and it grew from time to time. So they were able to furnish all the industry power at a very reasonable rate because of this gas raise. And a glass plant and the wire fence factory were located here, and shortly after we had 2 oil refineries built. So for a while we were quite a industrial town for a small town.
How much oil discovery was there?
Well, no large fields. Of course, the largest field was the Tonko field, which is south of us. But every direction from Blackwell, there was some small production of oil. Within 2 miles of the town, north, east, north, and east of town, a small amount west of town. The country club had a gas well that furnished them with gas. It was not a large one. For years they had their own gas right on the course.
Does you have rodeo in Blackwell?
Not as such. We have a rodeo ground, and we have a saddle club, and every now and then they put on one, but not any prominent rodeo, I wouldn't say.
What about the Rotary Club? You've been the president of that. Tell us a little about it. And its,
Well, the Blackwell Rotary Club got on the map fairly early from a project they started to. At that early days back there, the kids in the 8th grade were dropping out of school. They thought they had an education. And so they were able to get everyone finishing the 8th grade to go on to high school. And it was publicized and had right up in the Saturday Evening Post at that time. And it's been quite a prominent civic club ever since, and has furnished a great many of our city commissioners and mayors and so forth. And they're highly respected. They've worked for the town as well as the things in the community of value ever since.
Can you think in terms of the newspaper, swinging back to that, the operation of the newspaper then, as you remember with your father, what are some of the problems of newspapers in the earlier days?
Well, actually, to keep a printer, most of the printers in those days were tramp printers, they called them, and their trouble was they were drinkers, and you get a man on, hire him, and maybe he wouldn't come to work the day your paper was coming out. He'd be in bad shape. But I know my father used to complain that he had to do everything from set type to write the editorials and so forth. And even in a weekly newspaper, that's quite a job to do it all. And
now you were city clerk for a long time in Blackwell. Now in this, you were a part of city government, and also you probably saw through the records those parts of city government that you may not have even had a particular involvement in. Why don't you talk a little about some of the things that you recall that would be most interesting in the city government over the period you were involved?
Well, one of the main things that happened while I was city clerk, but it was for years we had drew water from wells, but in this country the underground water supply is very limited, and as the town grew, we didn't have enough water, and additional wells didn't seem to help, so the city decided to build a dam over in the Casca River, and it was a 20-foot high dam, 780 feet long, and it still supplies the water supply for the town. And its excellent water is not polluted by any oil fields, and the The only thing we have to contend with is siltation because it's farmlands all around us, and as the rains wash the silt of the river, it fills up behind the dam. But in 1961, we had that dredge all out, and the supply had run for 25 years at that time. It's still going today. I imagine it'll go another 25 years. That's probably the most important thing that the city government did was build that dam.
One thing we haven't talked about, which is probably the one of the big events, maybe the biggest event, although not a pleasant event in the history of Blackwell, was the tornado. Why don't you discuss that? I understand your home was involved in that.
Yes, well, it was a terrible thing because we had been told by the Indians that Blackwell would never be struck by a tornado. But on May 25th, I believe it was, 1955, about 9 o'clock in the evening, this tornado struck. My wife and I were alone in our home, and the roar was loud, but there was terrible hail preceded this storm, and it was so loud in our roof that we didn't hear the actual tornado noise. And my wife went to the door to close it, and it just sucked in out of her hand and slammed itself. There was suction in the house. And first thing we knew, we were under the house. And I received a broken pelvis from it and was in the hospital about a month, 6 weeks. And my wife had no broken bones, but she was bruised all over, black and blue everywhere. And our house was moved about 30 feet from its foundation out toward the street. And how we ever got under that floor, we never knew because we were on top of it when it hit.
You mean it put you under?
Under the floor.
You didn't go under. You didn't have a way to get up.
No way on earth, no sir. The floor had to open up and let us through someplace, and it apparently did, because when we came to, we were not unconscious, but when I was over, I realized the storm was over. It only lasted about 30 seconds, but everything in there, every house around us was torn almost completely down. There were about 400 houses destroyed, and we didn't receive one thing. We were the only two objects of any size that got out of our house. We had a small grand piano, an ice box, stove, and they were all gone. No evidence of any of them.
Were any killed in your neighborhood?
Yes, sir.
Did you have the feeling of knowing what was happening to you? I mean, obviously, by that time you knew it was a tornado or a wild storm, but could you tell how obviously you all were being moved
That's
in
right.
that house? Did you have any conception of how you were being moved, or were you separated from the floor, for instance, and moving in the air?
I don't think so. There were several other people who had the experience. I had a cousin, a woman probably 60 years old, who was sitting on a divan in her home. She was moved a block and sat down right on that divan, a block away from where she lived.
In the same divan?
Same divan.
Same tornado?
Yes, sir. And
were you conscious of her move?
oh yes, she was because she didn't know where she was going. It happened so fast, and nobody realizes how quickly one of those things hits and is gone. But we were able. My wife discovered a light sticking out. She said, I believe we can get out of here. Well, I had to go out on my back with my elbows and one leg because the other one was trying to help us. But we called out on the street, and we could see over the north of us a red light, and a glass plant which was operating had caught fire from the storm hit and blew down the buildings down on the fire, and it burned almost completely right now.
Tell about the effect of this on the town over the period following the tornado.
Well, everybody thought we would, this glass plant employed about 150 people, and we thought that was going to be a terrible blow, but almost immediately, city service moved in a LP plant, employed about the same number of people, and the business was not hurt, but there were 400 houses destroyed in this tornado, and the rebuilding of those, most of them were rebuilt, and better houses were blown down. So it made quite a nice business building for a building business for a while in town.
Were all of your possessions lost?
Everything. We didn't have them. In fact, I had my pajamas on, and we went to the hospital because I had this, I thought it was my back, but when I got out there, X-ray showed it was a pelvic bone. And the hospital floor was lined. There were 165 people on the floor waiting for doctors to take care of them at one time there. And by morning, doctors came in from everywhere and brought nurses, and they were very good to take care of all the people who were injured. But there were a lot of injuries. If you ask about the death, our street, which was E Street, there were, I believe, 20 people killed in the tornado, and 15 of them were in or just off of E Street. So it went right down the street.
You were right in the middle.
Oh, yes. The house I immediately back up to the man who was killed. Over to the left on the other side, the man was killed. And south of us, a block, right on the same street, the man was killed. And then sometimes it'd be midway in the block off that, a woman was killed. And we had one man and his wife that lived just a block north of us, and they were in the yard watching the storm. They had a cave at the back of the property, but they never got to the cave. And the woman's body was found the next day, and the man's body was not. They couldn't locate him at all. And his son came here from some distance, and he stayed up at the hotel, and next morning he said, I had a dream. I believe my father's under the house right over there. And they got a big crane and lifted that house up, and they found his body right where the boy dreamed. I never heard of that before.
They talk about how a disaster, what it does to pull people together and that sort of thing, and causing people to maybe be more helpful sometimes to one another and that sort of thing. Did you find this to be an experience of the tornado?
Very much so. Personally, we had no home or no place to go after the tornado, and an old man here in town, Mr. Dave Morgan, came out to the hospital and told me that he had a garage apartment furnished and all ready. Now I'm moving into it. And I stayed there a year till we could rebuild, and not one dime he ever take rent or anything.
Can you think of any other experiences, not maybe your own or other people's, that would indicate the same thing?
Well, I know that in yard work, everybody had new lawns to build and things like that, and the neighbors would pitch in and help them get the ground ready and sow it. And now that tornado was there is the best area in the town because it's newer. But everybody needs help, and the one thing that happened, the Mennonite group from Newton, Kansas, came in there and worked for weeks helping people clean up, and all they asked was their meals while I was there.
Do you think of anything else? We covered quite a bit of territory.
I don't think so. I don't know anything else.
This has been an interview with Mr. Carl Randall in Blackwell, Oklahoma, September 13, 1972. What a fun that.
You and I finished up almost at the same time.
Who did you have?